Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, October the 8th, 2025. Today there is a sextile aspect between Venus and Jupiter, and in this video I want to look at this aspect in some detail and consider what it might mean, and look at some examples of people with this configuration and also some events that took place when Venus was sextile Jupiter. But before I look at this aspect in detail, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Wednesday, October the 8th, 2025. So here is the chart for today, and don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So as far as what is going on, we have the moon in Taurus. You can see there it is, moon at 6 degrees 7 degrees Taurus at noon, sort of New York time. So, we have had the moon in Aries, and the moon was in a fire sign. It was always good to have some fire. But, now that the moon has gone into Taurus, again, there is no fire in the sky, if you like, unless you count Neptune and Chiron in Aries. So it might feel that, today, Wednesday, there's sort of less action than Tuesday. There might be, less excitement. It may be more difficult to sort of get things together. And, with the moon moving through Taurus rather than Aries, things could be steadier and slower. But we mustn't forget that moon in Taurus is moon is exalted in Taurus, so it's quite a good position for the moon to be in, especially early Taurus, because the degree of exaltation of the moon is 3 degrees Taurus, so we're pretty close to this degree, and so there could be just a certain solidity to today. But there is also the possibility of stubbornness. We have got Mercury and Mars in Scorpio and true black moon Lilith. And so the moon makes an opposition to Mercury, and it makes an opposition to Mars, and the moon will be on the sort of Mercury and Mars midpoint, and that means that it might be difficult to be flexible, particularly with ideas. And some people might have a very clear idea about how they want things to be, and in fact we've got a T-square because Pluto is involved. So the moon is making a square to Pluto, making an opposition to Mercury. That Mercury square Pluto that we had, I think, yesterday, it's still around, and the moon is picking up on it. And so that does highlight the concept of stubbornness and not being necessarily prepared to consider alternative viewpoints. You think about the moon and Mercury, these two communication planets, opposition each other. Are we able to communicate in a sort of a free-flowing way, in a sort of relaxed, easy way that other people can appreciate, and being accepting of other people's views? That's going to be hard work. Now we do have Pluto on the T. Pluto sort of mediating between Mercury and the moon, and ideally that Pluto in Aquarius is asking us to reconsider our own ideas. Maybe that is the way to deal with it. So if we come across opinions and people who we disagree with, don't just disagree with them for the sake of it. Consider the possibility that something needs to be transformed, and in the process we can maybe transform ourselves. Now those are the lunar aspects. Now the non-lunar aspect, the main non-lunar aspect, is a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. And I will be talking in much greater detail about this sextile between Venus and Jupiter at the end of the video. but Venus and Jupiter are the two benefics, and so they're in sextile. That's got to be good. Sextile is a fortunate aspect, and so when you've got Venus sextile Jupiter, it may turn out to be quite a fortunate day. I mean, you've got the moon in Taurus, exalted, and you've got this sextile aspect between Venus and Jupiter. Now, Venus is in Virgo, and you could argue that Venus is weak in Virgo, that it can't fully perform in this sign. Although Venus does rule the earthy triplicity by day, and it might be the case that this Venus sextile Jupiter is most effective during the hours of daylight. So if you've got anything important to do, try to do it, between sunrise and sunset. That's going to be, well, it shouldn't make much difference, should it? Because we're pretty close to the equinox, so I don't think there's any huge distinction between the northern and the southern hemisphere there. So, if possible, don't do things too late, or don't do things too early. Enjoy the daylight, make the most of the daylight, while you have the chance. So, I think that Venus sextile Jupiter is going to make it, or can make it, a good day. It's not a very exciting sextile. Jupiter in Cancer, Venus in Virgo, it's sort of negative signs, but it's about being able to gently take advantage of whatever it is might be available. As far as the picture in Australia and New Zealand and East Asia is concerned, here's the chart set for Sydney, and it is a bit different because the moon is in Aries at noon, and so that means that up until the late afternoon, moon is still going to be in this sign, and so it may be that all that it is the case that all that stuff I was talking about, moon in Taurus, isn't really going to apply until this evening and into tomorrow. So that's possibly the main difference. And but you've got the moon in a fire sign. Okay, the moon may not be doing very much in a fire sign. The moon is void of course in a fire sign. So if you're in Australasia, you can see the potential to make things happen, to create action, but are you really going to be able to see that potential through? The answer, might be no, because the moon is void, and so maybe you'll have to wait until this evening when the moon moves into Taurus for things to really happen, if you happen to be in Australasia or East Asia. And then there is the heliocentric view. So here is the chart from the viewpoint of the Sun, and that Mars-Uranus opposition is getting closer and closer. It's now, what is it, sort of 1.5 degrees apart. So Mars opposition Uranus. It's a collective energy. It says something about the world and what's bothering people and how people respond to crises. And with Mars opposition Uranus, there can be something that is really over dramatic about it. We might sort of jump to conclusions, or collective entities might jump to conclusions. And in general, Mars opposition Uranus, unfortunately, it can be connected with violence, but it's not a completely unusual aspect. I mean, there will be a Mars opposition Uranus heliocentrically, every couple of years, so it's not that spectacular. It doesn't seem to be tied in with anything else. It's not like you've got any other aspect. Although to an extent you have got Jupiter. Perhaps that's the point here. You see, Mars is 135 degrees from Jupiter. You see Mars 27, 24, plays 12, 19. You've got to get used to spotting those semi-squares and sesquiquadrates. If you've got Mars at 27, 24, you subtract 15 from 27, 24, and you get 12. And then late fixed always makes a semi-square sesquiquadrate to early cardinal. So once you remember that, it's quite easy to spot semi-squares and sesquiquadrates, and so you can indeed see that Mars is sesquiquadrate Jupiter. So with Mars sesquiquadrate Jupiter and opposition Uranus, you could say that Mars, Jupiter and Uranus are kind of coming together. And in this situation, I wouldn't necessarily regard Jupiter as being particularly fortunate. I would rather instead see Jupiter as just being expanding everything, making things larger and perhaps more problematic in this case. So that's the heliocentric view, and now I want to turn to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Wednesday, October the 8th, 2025. Aries, you might want to come down to earth. The moon is leaving your sign, and with the moon out of Aries into Taurus, you're perhaps going to feel that the scope for taking action, at least in a spontaneous way, is just not as good as it was over the last few days, and that might be dissatisfying. You might be looking for something which just isn't there. And from a positive perspective, it just might be that you need to contain what you have. Whatever you have built over the last few days, whatever you have decided on, whatever initiatives you have started, you've got to consolidate. And that is perhaps the meaning of Moon in Taurus. Especially if you're an Aries, consolidation. Making sure that everything is built properly. It's all in order and has sufficient structure. And inevitably, this means that you have to consider the material plane, and I'm afraid sort of money could play a role. And if we're looking at the financial side of things, the moon in Taurus, it is making an opposition to Mercury, and it's also making an opposition to Mars, and those aspects could indicate financial strain, disagreement. You don't seem to be entirely comfortable with money, especially if there are other people to have to deal with. If you have to deal with other people, if there's a potential for conflict, there's just a general air of dissatisfaction, that things aren't working as they should, that you need to perhaps argue about things. I mean, that might be the temptation, if money crops up, for whatever reason. So Aries, what do you do? Well, you need to hold firm to what you believe in. That's important, and maybe you shouldn't make it too complicated. Aries and money. I think that most Arians, especially if they're true to themselves, are not particularly interested in money. Certainly not just in money for the sake of it. The purpose of money, if you are an Aries, is to just help you do stuff. It's not an end in itself. I mean, okay, I'm making a generalization here, and talking about money, obsessing about money is something that Aries often finds just quite distasteful. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't times when money does matter, and maybe now is a time when you do need to start to consider, the financial dimension. And if there's something that is complicated, If someone is creating a problem, something is creating a problem, then maybe you should sort it out. And I think that if you stick to what you know and stick to what you trust, I think that you should be able to deal with the matter. And you should not expect things to move too quickly. Not just from a sort of material and financial perspective. Things can be slow. And you may be, especially impatient with, bureaucracies, governments, administration. It just takes time. And so if you are having to deal with, bureaucracy at whatever level, whether it's at the level of a state or in the US, they'd say it would be a federal bureaucracy, or whether it's your city or your county, having to deal with bureaucrats and administration and form filling could just be really slow. And you might also be irritated by other people's concerns about doing it right. Other people, maybe, they are concerned about, how they do things bureaucratically, how they relate to government, what might happen if they fell foul of government. And so that could be an issue for you. People are afraid of government. I mean, they really are. I mean, I've certainly sort of noticed this, where I am here in suburban America. People just are afraid. They're afraid that, if they make a fuss, if they complain about something, City Hall might sort of note them down, and when they ask for an extension to their house, or they ask for a license or a permission, the City Hall will sort of remember, and they will deny them. I think that's just plain paranoia, but it is something I've observed, and it's possible, Aries, you will notice somehow that people are worried and inhibited when it comes to administration and government and things like that. Now, one aspect we have which is more positive is a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. Now, this Venus-Jupiter aspect, I will be talking about it later in this video, but I do regard it as being something fortunate. And if you want to make the most of this Venus sextile Jupiter, it's possible, but you will need the assistance of someone else. Now, Venus sextile Jupiter could be referring to someone you know well, someone who perhaps is going to be more helpful than usual. You don't have to do things on your own, and if you're involved in something that's difficult and you need help, then I think that you can get help, and you just have to ask. And if you're in any relationship, Venus sextile Jupiter, that is a calming influence, and perhaps partners, loved ones, etc., are going to perhaps be sort of more, perhaps calmer and sort of more positive and optimistic than usual. Taurus. I think, Taurus, today should be fine. For a start, the moon is moving into your sign. Moon does well in Taurus. Moon is exalted in Taurus. And in fact, by night, the moon in Taurus rules the earthy triplicity. So it's a great place for the moon to be. And at the same time, Venus, your ruling planet, is making a sextile to Jupiter. So Jupiter is the planet of good fortune. So this means, as far as I can see, that you should be luckier than average, and you can afford to be spontaneous and creative, and at the same time you're able to see things through. So if you've been working on something and you want to really complete it, then now is your chance. And also Venus sextile Jupiter reminds you of what you can do, and the fact that there are certain things that you can do extremely well, and you don't have to make a fuss about it. It's just clear. It's obvious. And so Taurus, it's not a time to doubt yourself, and you don't, I think, have to make too much of a fuss about it. And I think that's important, actually. You could possibly make today more complicated than it need be. I mean, if you wanted to. But if you want to keep it simple, you can. You're fine, you're creative, you're lucky, you're able to be open about what's on your mind. But if you want to make things complicated, yeah, you certainly can, because the moon in Taurus does make an opposition to Mercury. It also makes a square to Pluto. So we've got a T-square here involving the fixed signs. And the question is this T-square going to be constructive? You might see this T-square as a conflict. Now, there's absolutely no need for a conflict. Venus is sextile Jupiter. You can be a peacemaker. You can smooth things over. You can create harmony if you want to. But some Taurians can be difficult. You have your views. Other people have their views. You might decide that you want to dig your heels in. Moon opposition Mercury. Moon opposition Mercury can be about a disagreement. Mercury in Scorpio can represent someone who has views which might be very different from your own. And, once you start talking, once you start disagreeing, things could get tense, very quickly. And the moon is also making a square to Pluto. So moon square Pluto is not a very relaxing aspect, but it's a very constructive one. It is about you deciding what your priorities are and just giving it everything you've got. And then the question is, what happens? And in terms of any conflict today, I think that it's really a question of how much you want to push that moon square Pluto. As I've said, moon square Pluto is quite an ambitious aspect. It wants to make things happen. It can be very determined. So the more ambitious you are, the more determined you are today, the more likely it is that you're going to run into opposition, or at least run into apparent opposition, because then the moon opposition Mercury comes into play. And if there is any opposition and anyone disagrees with you, especially if it's about a subject that's very important to you, then you have no choice but to go with it, because this T-square involving Moon, Mercury and Pluto can be very constructive if you're mature about it. If you see conflict as being dynamic, getting some feedback, if you're told you're doing something wrong, if you're given an alternative view, you shouldn't get upset. You should see this as something to make the most of. And if you have a disagreement or a heated discussion, something might emerge from it. And what might emerge from it is Pluto. Pluto in Aquarius is about your ambitions and perhaps reforming your ambitions and elevating these ambitions to something that is even more powerful and even more real. So in the last half of this sort of piece I've been articulating or trying to articulate on Taurus, I've been kind of suggesting that there is a complicated side to the day, and this might really contradict what I've just been saying. So I kind of started off with Venus sextile Jupiter, Moon in Taurus. It's all very easy, all very nice. And then you move into this Moon, Mercury, Pluto stuff. So what is the contradiction about? I think the contradiction is about choice and perhaps circumstances. If you are a sort of relaxed person and there's nothing that has to be done, you've got everything sorted out, then probably you don't even have to worry about Moon square Pluto, Moon opposition Mercury. It's just an easygoing day. And that's as far as it goes. And I think that you're going to get plenty of support from other people as well. It's just going to be straightforward. But if there's any discontent there, anything that you want to do, you want to achieve, you feel you've got to push yourself, well, then that's a different matter. You're still going to be lucky. Venus is sextile Jupiter. Moon is in Taurus. That's true. But it might be harder work. And in that case, you've got to make more of an effort to understand people and perhaps to deal with opposition. But I think in most cases it should be constructive opposition. Gemini. Moon is opposition Mercury. And of course, Mercury is your ruler, but it's your ruler in Scorpio. And so maybe, Gemini, you're still getting used to Mercury being in Scorpio. It's a difficult energy, as I was saying yesterday in my forecast for Tuesday. Of course, now it's Wednesday, but you're not comfortable with Mercury in Scorpio because Mercury in Scorpio, well, it's a water sign, and it's not such a noisy place for Mercury. Mercury in Scorpio, it's a water sign, and by definition, it's one of the mute signs. So there's less to be said and more to be felt, and that may be how the Moon opposition Mercury is working. Gemini, you could find that you're spending more time feeling than thinking, and from an emotional perspective, it's possible that things just affect you more than usual, and that might be a surprise and perhaps a concern. Especially now that we don't just have Moon opposition Mercury, we have Pluto, Moon square Pluto. We have Mercury is still square Pluto. So probably what's happening is that this Mercury-Pluto square, which was exact yesterday, is still very much operational. In fact, it may be stronger today than it was yesterday. So you are being challenged, Mercury square Pluto, by something which may be beyond you, and you're having to get into things quite deeply. You don't necessarily want to get into things deeply, and as soon as you start getting into things deeply, you realize more and more things, and what you thought was going to be straightforward becomes complicated. So for example, if you've got a plan and you're trying to execute this plan, you hoped it would be straightforward. It's clearly not straightforward at all, and there are real complications here. And Gemini, it's up to you to deal with these complications. Now, some of these complications may be philosophical and ethical. What is the right thing to do? Sometimes Geminis can be quite fluid when it comes to ethics. You can change your ethics, depending on the situation, moving from one principle to another. That's perhaps Gemini at its worst, but it may be necessary, and you need to sort of start to think about how you're going to approach a particular problem given the new situation. And with Mercury in Scorpio, this could make you more compassionate. I mean, it really could. Being able to feel things that in the past you hadn't been able to do. And it can take Gemini a long time to get emotionally affected, but it often happens in the end. It's not like you're a Cancer, who just gets the point very quickly, or a Scorpio. Geminis, they have to sit and watch and wait and allow their feelings to emerge, allow their compassion to emerge. It takes time, but and Mercury in Scorpio, it is in a fixed sign. So fixed signs are slow, but you get there in the end, and so that's something you might be experiencing. And so Gemini, don't feel that things have to take immediate action. You might have to stew And that's not something Geminis like to do, just stew, just wait and brood and work out what to do. But I think there could be just a moment of clarity where things finally make sense. Could take a long time. It could be at the last moment, finally things click together. And finally, Gemini, you understand what needs to be done. Of course, when Geminis know what needs to be done, they can act, very quickly. But you have to get your timing right, and don't be in a hurry. Don't act on the basis of a few facts here and there. You want to come to a conclusion, but it could take you a long time, and you do have to work at several different levels. Particularly with this moon opposition Mercury, there is an emotional side, and you have to think things through in your own way without getting any sort of interference. So Gemini, it could be a complicated day, and you have to let things develop, and you have to let yourself develop, because I think that there's a lot happening on an inner level. But when the moment arrives, and I think the moment will arrive, you'll know exactly what needs to be done. Cancer. Moon is in Taurus, and the moon is exalted in Taurus. It's a good placement for the moon, and this means that as far as you're concerned, things can be quite straightforward if you want them to be straightforward. If you want to enjoy yourself in a quiet kind of way, you can. And I think that you'll find companionship, if need be. It may not be especially exciting, but if you need support or friendship with Moon in Taurus, it's certainly there for the taking. But you need to keep things simple. That is important, because the Moon in Taurus, it does make an opposition aspects to Mercury and Mars. So Moon opposition Mercury, it's quite a verbal opposition. The Moon and Mercury are both planets of communication. The Moon is more about sort of emotional communication, Mercury more about sort of mental communication. And so when you have the opposition, the question is, what do you say? And Moon opposition Mercury could be agitated, especially as the Moon is making a square to Pluto. And so this might mean, Cancer, that you don't have to be agitated if you just you do what is safe, and you don't take risks. You don't go anywhere where controversies and arguments are possible. But if you start to get into things sort of more deeply, especially with other people, it's very likely that this Moon opposition Mercury, Moon square Pluto, will start to kick into life. It just suddenly happens. And once it does kick into life, it may be difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. And one irritation could turn into another irritation, could turn into sort of major stress. But still, you're strong. I mean, you are strong. It's not just because the Moon is in Taurus. It's also because the Venus is making a sextile to Jupiter. That aspect is a great aspect. Remember, Jupiter is in your sign, so you're lucky and you're strong. And if you want to stay out of trouble, you can stay out of trouble. But if you're going to get involved in something which is at all complicated, you just need to realize that things could get difficult very quickly. So perhaps you need to make your choices. And when I say difficult, I don't mean that it's bad or unlucky. It's quite possible that you're going to be able to take advantage of the situation, but it just could be hard work. And for many people, not just Cancerians, today is a matter of choice. What do you want to focus on? I can talk about Moon in Taurus. I can talk about Venus sextile Jupiter. These are configurations that are good. They are lucky. But the question is, do you want to get involved in this T-square, Moon in Taurus, square Pluto, opposition Mercury, where it might be you against other people, you being controversial, perhaps someone else being controversial, there being a battle. Now, if there is a battle, then there's a good chance you're going to win it. Cancerians, as I keep saying, are difficult people to beat. Talking about Venus-Jupiter sextiles, it is likely that Julius Caesar, for example, who was a Cancerian, also had a Venus-Jupiter sextile. I don't think we're 100% sure when Julius Caesar was born, but Julius Caesar is an example of a Cancerian, who was really able to thrive on conflict. Though, of course, if you take things too far, if you annoy people too much, they might in the end turn on you, as happened with Julius Caesar. But that's all unnecessary. So Cancer, are you ready to take on the world and force people into compliance, to argue with them, argue your point, to sort of win your argument? If you're ready, if that's what you want, that's certainly something you can do. If that's something you don't want to do, you don't have to do it. You can just drift, enjoy people's company, just don't linger for too long. If you don't want a complicated day, just keep moving. Don't feel that you have to pursue any point or any argument very far. You can just change the subject. That's something you can do. But maybe Cancer, that's not what you want to do. And if you want to make the absolute most of today, and I do think it is a lucky day, but if you do want to make the most of the day, it is possible that you might have to introduce an element of conflict, at least on a verbal level. Leo, you in your own way, Leo, can be quite charismatic. People are going to like you, and at the same time you're going to be able to sort of take things further. You're going to be able to help people make the most of who they are, again, if that's what you want to do. And so, Leo, you are potentially a good person to have around, and you can sort of make new friendships, develop new contacts, however you want to do it, whether it's face to face or online. You can really be at the center of things. And I think you're going to be helped by the fact that the moon is moving into Taurus. So, with the moon moving into Taurus, Leo, that can make you really very prominent. You can stand out as someone who has really got something to offer, and people will notice you, and they'll listen to you. And I think that they will trust you. Things aren't always stable. That's the world we're living in. But Moon in Taurus does give the possibility of finding a level of stability. And Leo, you're the person that can very much provide it. And perhaps, Leo, it's a time when you can display clear leadership. And if you do want to display leadership, it's important that you don't sort of worry about it too much. You don't think about it too much. Because if you have doubts and you have questions, people are going to pick up on that. And the more doubts you have, then they might respond to those doubts, and they might try to undermine you. So if you're going to be a leader, and I think you can be a leader today, you've got to be very clear. And you've got to be very confident. And you might be aware that you're dealing with powerful personalities, but you've still got to regard yourself as being the most powerful person in the room, and you can do that through your own willpower, but also just having just an easy confidence about you, and always trying to stray from arguments. Remember, there's a moon opposition Mercury, moon is square Pluto. Just try and stray away from that. Keep it simple if at all possible. But moon is opposition Mercury. That opposition could come into play. So in what situation would it come into play? It would, or could, come into play if you are dealing with people that have very different priorities from your own. And this could represent your family, or people from a different circle of friends. You've got one set of priorities, and people don't really know about this. And so they just make assumptions, and they don't know what you're trying to achieve, and what you're doing doesn't seem to conform with what they're trying to do. And so that might relate to family, people you know well, people who have expectations of you, and those kind of people just might try to grab your attention, might try to raise issues that you don't really want to deal with, you don't need to deal with. So maybe, Leo, you should be very careful about how you choose your company. First of all, decide what kind of day you want, and decide what kind of people you need around you to support your ambitions, whatever those ambitions might be, and then stick to it. If you try to have a balancing act, dealing with one group of people, dealing with another group of people, and a third group of people even, it's just not going to work, because you're going to have too many pressures, and almost inevitably there are going to be disagreements. So, Leo, just decide what is important, and then just stick with it, and just be confident, and don't get drawn. Don't get drawn into controversy, because I don't think that controversy is going to help you at the moment. And also remember that you, from a interpersonal point of view, there's just something about you that is flowing, easygoing, and the right people will appreciate that. Now, as far as one-to-one relationships are concerned, it may be relevant, the fact that the moon is square Pluto, that Mercury is square Pluto, and Pluto can represent everything you believe about another person. Pluto in Aquarius, Pluto in your opposite sign. So your beliefs about another person are not necessarily real. It's instead someone playing things according to your script. Aquarius represents the part of yourself which you're least aware of, the part of yourself that you're most likely to project onto another person. And so with Moon square Pluto, Mercury square Pluto, it could be that you create a problem out of nothing. You imagine that someone is someone or something that they're not, and you push your unconscious embodiments. What do I mean by that? We all have these sort of beings that are inhabiting our unconscious, perhaps memories, and we sort of project them onto other people. We project them onto partners and loved ones, and we create an imaginary situation. We expect someone to perform a particular role. So you need to avoid all that, and you should just take people as they are, and as far as you possibly can, not project. I mean, we all project. I just think that at the moment you may be more vulnerable than usual than sort of projecting whatever you are projecting, whether it's sort of, I don't know, your unconscious demons, or it could be memories of parents, for example. That's how projection works. So if you possibly can, try to avoid projection. But of course, projection is inevitable. That's part of being human, at least it's part of being human if you sort of take a psychological, psychoanalytical view of the world. Virgo. I see no reason why it can't be a good day. After all, Venus is making a sextile to Jupiter. Venus is, of course, moving through Virgo. It's moving through your sign. So with Venus sextile Jupiter, it seems to me that you're going to be on good form, and you will give the impression of being on good form. Jupiter, is a planet that is fortunate. It can relate to other people, and you being able to really project yourself, extremely well. It's very easy. It's very natural, or at least it should be. Don't overthink it. I think that really does matter today, especially in sort of social interactions. There is a possibility that Virgo can be, self-conscious, wondering what kind of impact you're having, and perhaps sort of moderating who you are, and that wouldn't be such a good thing, because Venus sextile Jupiter, even though Venus is in Virgo, it tries to be natural. It should be natural. And, it also, don't be too questioning of the other person, whoever that other person might be. Just listen to what you're being told. Listen to what someone is saying. Don't feel that you always have to interrupt or question or confront. Now, if you do that, then the day might not be quite so easy, at least from a social perspective. There is an opposition aspect between the moon and Mercury. So, this could sort of operate in sort of many ways, but it might be about opinions. We all have opinions. You have opinions. Other people might express their opinions. If you hear something that you wildly disagree with, then don't necessarily argue back. Don't necessarily pick someone up on that. Yeah, you do pick up on a lot. You are a Virgo, but sometimes it's best just to say nothing. And so, Virgo, the easier going you can be, probably the better for yourself, and also the better for everyone else. And I do think if you handle things correctly, it should be a fortunate day. And also, the moon is in Taurus. The moon is exalted in Taurus, and the moon is in an earth sign. So, that can sort of allow you to relax, and this relaxation can, just help you just tune into the world, and ideally, you won't let your views and your opinions get in the way. So just observe, and don't feel that you always have to comment. Nonetheless, it does seem that right now, Virgo, you have a lot of energy. You can try to relax, but your energy needs an expression. So the question then is, how do you express this energy? Now, you could express your energy verbally, just by saying what's on your mind, talking about your opinions, but that's probably not the right way to do it. I mean, I think, as I've already indicated, if you're too verbal, it could spoil things. So maybe there are other ways of expressing your energy. Maybe just by taking gentle exercise, that might be one approach, or perhaps building up to something. There might be a moment today when it is absolutely appropriate to express yourself, with sort of maximum power. But Virgo, it's very important that you get your timing right. If you were to throw all your energy into something without really thinking it through, and you're in company, and suddenly you go from being someone who is just in the background, people aren't noticing you, and suddenly you're there and you are looking for action, and you're just really going for it. Well, that could be quite disturbing. On the other hand, Virgo, if you want to make an impact today, then certainly you can do it. But you have to think it through. You have to think about, the longer term. What kind of effect are you trying to produce? Just because you can create an effect doesn't mean that it is necessarily the right thing to do. Libra. Venus sextile Jupiter. That is the headline aspect for today. Venus Jupiter sextile, it's got to be a good aspect, hasn't it? I mean, sextile is fortunate, and Venus and Jupiter are the two most fortunate planets in the solar system, and also Venus is your ruler. So with those two aspects coming together, with those two planets coming together, I think that you can be optimistic, and if you handle it right, then you can sort of gain the full benefits. But the question is, what is the best way of handling is Venus sextile Jupiter? You have to think about what kind of sextile this is, for you. And this aspect, although it's fortunate, is somewhat understated. It's not about, for example, having a massive piece of spectacular luck in a sort of a dramatic way. I don't think that's how it works. This is a negative sextile. Both Jupiter and Venus are in negative signs. In other words, negative signs are the earth and water signs. Jupiter in Cancer, Venus in Virgo. Additionally, Venus in Virgo. This is a placement, Libra, which is quite introspective as far as you're concerned. I mean, Virgo is the sign before Libra. Okay, when Venus moves into Libra, things change, but while Venus is still in Virgo, you don't want to reveal everything. And even if you do have some luck, you don't want to talk about it immediately. And so the best way of dealing with this Venus sextile Jupiter is to do everything in a kind of a sort of a roundabout way. You are able to work in the shadows if need be. You don't have to be center stage. In fact, if you are center stage, I think that you're going to, lose a lot of your power and your effectiveness. So Libra, you have your ambitions. I mean, it's great to have these ambitions, but you don't have to talk about them, and you can quietly get it together in ways that just people don't see. And so if you can work behind the scenes, slowly working on the things that are important to you, and just avoid discussing it, I think that really matters. If you talk about something too much, you lose your strength, you lose your power, and you don't want to necessarily announce something. Even if you're very excited about it, you might be excited about something. You might think this has got real potential. You want to talk about it. You want to get some feedback, but it might be the case that the moment you start to talk about something, it immediately loses its power. The words kill it, and it might be that if you have decided to talk about something that is important to you, it means that that at an unconscious level, you've started to give up on it. And the things that are going to work are the things you don't discuss. And that goes back to this Venus sextile Jupiter. You don't have to be open about it. The luck of that Venus sextile Jupiter is going to work best if it is hidden, if it is something relatively private, or it might involve someone else, perhaps. If you are involved with a project, you and someone else, and you've been working on it, still you don't want to tell other people. But I think in most cases It is going to be something that is just down to you, and something that you don't necessarily want to think about. Well, you want to think about it, but that's where it stops. You certainly don't want to talk about it. And so I think that's the best way of dealing with this sextile. And we do have an opposition aspect between the Moon and Mercury, and this Moon-Mercury opposition, again, it really gravitates towards you not discussing things. Moon opposition Mercury, it's an opposition. I mean, it's a very verbal opposition, and once you start to get involved in a conversation, the conversation could get stuck very, very quickly, because the Moon in Taurus opposition Mercury in Scorpio, two fixed signs, and it's across the financial axis of your chart. So if you start talking about money, for example, or who's going to get paid, who's not going to get paid, if money is owed to you, whatever it is, it's just going to get nowhere, because you're dealing with different opinions, and that's perhaps the problem about today. The luck is in your own world. If you start to try to share yourself and share your ideas, then the luck sort of grinds to a standstill very quickly. And if you're talking about money with Moon opposition Mercury, it just may not get anywhere. And instead, you need to think about yourself. And that's where you should place your attention. If you place it with other people, if you rely on other people, if you assume that other people are going to respond in particular ways, then you might be disappointed, and your luck could go down the drain. But it needn't happen. I think that this Venus sextile Jupiter is really pushing you in a particular way, and on your own. For the moment, I say for the moment, it's not like you have to keep everything to yourself forever, but just, right now, perhaps, over the next few days, it's just best not to feel that you have to talk. Some things are just best not to be discussed. Because words can be so damaging, and words can also, they can trivialize things. You've created something very special. Perhaps that's what you can do, but as soon as you talk, the words just mangle it, and that's just not something that you want to happen. Scorpio. Other people may, to an extent, matter. You don't want them to matter, but they could. And the reason for this is that the Moon is now in Taurus. Moon is in your opposite sign, and so when the Moon is in Taurus, the focus can be on the other, what other people are doing, and the flux in your life can be created by outside actors. And that's just the way it is. And the question is, how do you respond to the situation? Now, the Moon is making an opposition to Mercury today, and it's also making an opposition to Mars. So Mercury and Mars, those two planets, are both in your sign. You've just had Mercury moving into Taurus, and so with Mercury moving into Scorpio, you've just had Mercury moving into Scorpio, so your sign. So this could perhaps make you more verbal than usual. You've got an opinion on most things. Scorpio is quite an opinionated sign, and you're able to talk about your opinions if need be. And with Mars also in Scorpio, you can be quite aggressive about it. But then the Moon comes in. The Moon in Taurus could represent another person, another situation responding to your opinions, or perhaps you responding to them, and it could represent a bit of an argument. There's a lot of argument today. It's quite an argumentative day, and it's not just about you, Scorpio. I've been using the word argument quite a lot. I mean, I think one has to use the word argument with Moon opposition Mercury, and with an argument, there are different types of arguments. There are arguments that can be constructive, where you discuss things and the right answer wins through. But with Moon in Taurus, Mercury in Scorpio, in fixed signs, this does suggest a more substantial disagreement. And even if you are not arguing, you are still listening, and you are listening to what people are saying, and you're listening to people's ideas and their plans, and you might respond badly. It might occur to you, but you don't want any part of it. And this might be the real purpose of these aspects, Moon opposition Mercury, Moon opposition Mars, to make a distinction. About you and other people. What is the difference? Where is the boundary? Where are the borders? To what extent can you trust another person? To what extent can you work with another person? And this might mean that issues, of autonomy do rise to the fore. And with Scorpio, the concept of autonomy, often matters. Scorpios can put, great value to their own independence, and they might not take kindly to people overstepping the boundaries. And so perhaps this is one way in which the Moon opposition Mercury, and indeed Moon opposition Mars, is working. On the other hand, it's important not to completely give up on other people, because there is a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. Venus is, of course, ruler of Taurus. Taurus is your opposite sign. So with Venus sextile Jupiter, it does seem that the right relationships can work very well. And the reason they work very well is because of another person's behavior and another person's attitude. And so maybe, Scorpio, if you're making choices about other people, consider their attitude and consider their response to you, and use your sensitivity to understand the other person, the other person you're dealing with. Some people may not be helpful; they just may be contrary for the sake of it. But other people have got something to offer, and what you should be looking for is perhaps broad-mindedness. If someone demonstrates themselves to be broad-minded and to be open to new possibilities, then this would be the kind of person that you should be ready to sort of spend your time with. Now, as far as existing relationships are concerned, maybe with Venus sextile Jupiter, you can see the best in another person, even if you don't always agree with them. And with Venus sextile Jupiter, that does indicate that a person who has perhaps appeared to be not as generous as they should be recently, may show a different side. They may show a generosity that you perhaps weren't expecting. Sagittarius, I have been talking about Venus sextile Jupiter quite a lot, and I'll be talking about it again at the end of this video, and I'll be going into this aspect in detail. Now, Venus sextile Jupiter inevitably is going to have an impact on you, because Jupiter is your ruler, and Venus is making a sextile to Jupiter. So at the very least, this Venus sextile Jupiter should give you some extra luck. I mean, Venus is the lesser benefic, Jupiter is the greater benefic. And so, don't give up on anything or anyone. The world wants you to be fortunate, and the world is providing you with opportunities, and these opportunities could take many forms. But if, for example, you are working or doing anything which is status or career orientated, then Venus sextile Jupiter may be referring to a turn of events which is fortunate, and it might relate to one particular person. Perhaps there's an offer, or someone behaves in a way which you weren't expecting, but you really appreciate it. And do be open-minded. Right now you can benefit from people who have a good sense of detail. Venus in Virgo, perhaps a sense of detail that you don't always have. There may be things that you don't understand and you brush over them. I mean, you could understand them, but you can't be bothered, but you brush over them and you miss the important points. And sometimes it's good to have another person giving a different view. So if it's something you don't fully understand, or you feel that you've been making an assumption that just doesn't really make sense, you can get help. So Venus sextile Jupiter may just mean that you are not alone, that there are people out there who really can be helpful. But even if it's not other people, Venus sextile Jupiter can be about presentation. So Sagittarius, you're able to present yourself very well, and you're able, if you make the real effort, you know how to present yourself given the situation. So situations can change. Different situations require a different approach, but you're going to get that all. Again, if you make the effort. At the moment, Sagittarius, you are more sensitive than usual. You don't fully appreciate this. You perhaps don't regard yourself as being especially sensitive, especially sort of, emotionally fluid, but you can understand at an emotional level what is going on. You can understand other people's sensitivities, and you can present yourself in the right way. And this is especially the case when we're talking about presentation as far as work, getting what you want, trying to impress someone. This all should be quite straightforward. But at the same time, we do have the moon in Taurus making an opposition to Mercury, opposition to Mars, and that moon opposition Mercury could be an irritant. It might be about you trying to get something right and trying too hard to get something right. So I was just suggesting that you know how to behave. You can know how to behave. You can know how to present yourself. But you don't want to take it too seriously. You don't want to push things too far, because moon opposition Mercury could be about you, Sagittarius, being a perfectionist, wanting it all to be so perfect that it just can't be done. And you might then be trying to make it 100% so perfect that whenever something goes wrong, you have to start again, and at the same time, your unconscious may be messing something up. So you could be overthinking things, and worries may appear from nowhere, and this could make things difficult, and it could create a situation where you cannot progress. And I'm just warning you here. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I mean, I do think it's going to be a good day, and you can get things right, but you can take things too far if you try to move beyond rightness towards absolute perfection, as I think you could do. Then it's just going to require an increasing amount of effort. So probably the best approach is to maybe watch the time. ask yourself, how long are you going to try to get things as good as they possibly can? Give yourself a time limit, and when that time limit has been reached, just say, well, you've done your best. And if you always think about that, you've done your best, and you can't give it any more time because there are other things to do. If you take that approach, then I think that today should be fine. Capricorn, don't assume that the way things were in the past, is just a representative of the future, that there can be no change. That can be a Capricorn tendency. Capricorn has a good sense of history very often, and at the same time Capricorns can be of the view that things don't change. You can have small adjustments, but the fundamental flow is just constant. Now, there can be advantages in that, and always having a good sense of tradition, but it can be taken too far. And at the moment, Capricorn, you can afford to look at things in a new way and to be aware of new possibilities. When I was doing your horoscope for yesterday, I emphasized the importance of freedom, and that you don't have to be tied to anything. And I would continue with that same message. You absolutely don't. If something has become boring, it's no longer doing you any good, it feels as if it's restraining you, then you absolutely don't you don't have to put up with it. And with the right actions, if you just trust yourself, you can end up today, not just today, but into sort of tomorrow as well, feeling relief that something is over, something that was bothering you has finally gone. So is there something like this, something that you really are getting sick of, and if you're honest with yourself, you want to get rid of it? Well, now might be your chance. And additionally, we've got Venus sextile Jupiter. Venus sextile Jupiter, it's a good aspect, and this aspect can affect you because Jupiter is in Cancer, it's in your opposite sign, and with Venus sextile Jupiter, that might say something about other people. It could say something about how they're behaving or how they could behave. And you may have made assumptions about certain people. You have perhaps regarded them as being of limited use, or you have sort of learnt to put up with them, and you may not have fully considered the other side of the coin, how they could be a plus in your life if you give them a chance. And so with Venus sextile Jupiter, do try to give people a chance, a second chance. I'm not saying you have to give people a third or a fourth or a fifth chance, but just because someone has been disappointing in the past doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to be disappointing again. Although if it is a pattern of disappointment, that is a different matter. And additionally, Capricorn, do think about the future and what you are planning on doing. What are your ambitions? And it's quite likely that you can look at your ambitions in a new way and realize that something is possible. And perhaps recently you thought it was impossible, but things are changing. Perhaps you haven't fully recognized that they're changing, and you can make things happen, and you can make something happen in a way that is entirely satisfactory. And I don't think you have to do it, on your own. I think that, help is available, and some people want you to succeed, and if you listen to them, they might say something important that could really help you to move on. And it's not something that you have to get involved with complicated discussions and different viewpoints and agonizing over it. I mean, there is some temptation to go in that direction. The moon in Taurus is making an opposition to Mercury, but if you find that anyone is questioning your fundamental ideas, then you don't have to. You don't have to go down that road. It is all about respect, and respect is there. You can find respect. You don't have to put up with anyone who is being disrespectful. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that in most cases, Capricorn, you can rely on other people to see you through. But even if there are even if there's no one around, still, this Venus sextile Jupiter, it's a great aspect. It is fortunate, and it allows you to sort of reimagine, whatever your goals might be. And you certainly shouldn't be a prisoner of history. So if things haven't worked in the past, that doesn't mean to say that they're not going to work in the future. And I think that if you have a positive mindset, you'll quickly see how well things can really turn out for you. Aquarius. Mercury is still in Scorpio. Well, it's going to be in Scorpio for some time. I mean, it's just moved into Scorpio, and Mars is in Scorpio as well. So this should be very motivating. This is a time when you can sort of rise to the challenge, whatever that challenge might be. Now, not everyone is going to agree with you. There will, in places, be resistance. The Moon is making an opposition to Mercury. Moon is also making an opposition to Mars, and you have to sort of get this opposition in perspective. Now, the Moon is in Taurus, so the Moon is quite strongly placed, and so this might mean that there are questions about some of your ideas, some of your plans, some of the things you want to do. You may not get full support, especially when dealing with members of your family, for example, or things going on in your home. It just may seem that home and ambition, those two concepts, they seem to be at odds with one another right now, with the Moon opposition Mercury and Mars. And Aquarius, you can't just ignore resistance. If what you are doing is making people agitated, if people are not happy about what you're doing, then by all means listen. Try to understand the complaints that other people are making or the queries they have. But understanding is not the same as giving in. Fundamentally, Aquarius, you've got it right. And at the same time, Aquarius, this is absolutely not a time for you to be feeling trapped or to be feeling obliged. It's a time to be really being it's a time to be yourself, and to break free of any restrictions that you might be aware of. I mean, I said a similar thing yesterday, and what I said yesterday applies to today, but arguably in a way that is even stronger. So Aquarius, what do you want? What might be holding you back? Well, it needn't hold you back. You can really be yourself here. And so, don't apologize, and, don't forget about your fundamental ambitions. Now, they might have to be explained. There's nothing wrong with that. But not everyone is going to understand what you're saying. But you don't have any obligation. There should be no obligation here. It's about giving yourself opportunities and not tying yourself up in knots. I don't think that will happen. And this Moon opposition Mercury that I was talking about, it's more than that. It's a T-square. We've got Moon square Pluto, we've got Mercury square Pluto, and Pluto is on the T. So with Pluto on the T, it means that Pluto is a transformative energy, and Pluto is in Aquarius. It's about you making the transformation, and Mercury is still square Pluto. So don't underestimate yourself, don't underestimate your power, and don't underestimate your ability to create, rapid change. You don't have to put up with the way things are. You can move up, you can move further, and you can move beyond. And maybe once you start to unleash your transformative energy, you'll be creating an unstoppable momentum. Pisces. Venus is making a sextile to Jupiter. That is the big aspect of the day. Jupiter is, of course, your ruling planet. So Venus sextile Jupiter, logically, this is very fortunate. Venus is the lesser benefic. So what Venus touches, at least by sextile or trine, by a fortunate aspect, it should benefit. So I think that this Venus-Jupiter sextile should very much work in your favor, and it might be a time when relationships could surprise to the upside. Recently I've been warning you that you have to be a little careful when dealing with other people because of the presence of the South Node in Virgo, and Venus has been conjunct the South Node, and I've indicated that maybe there's a tendency on your part to give other people too much time, to sort of defer to other people's supposed better judgment. But that is not the right approach. It is a time very much for Pisceans to be thinking about themselves. Yet with this Venus sextile Jupiter, it may be a time when you can start to be more trusting. Venus is now moving away from the South Node. It's over 5 degrees from the South Node, and so perhaps you can be sort of more open. And with Venus sextile Jupiter, this aspect does look pretty good, as far as relationships are concerned. If relationships are important to you, you can find the right people who are supportive. It's not about you following anyone's instructions or doing what you're told. That's not what it's about. You're in a place where your own individuality needs to be supported, needs to be encouraged. That's what you should be looking for. Now, encouragement doesn't have to be uncritical. Venus in Virgo is quite a critical placement. It could be, Pisces, that you could be doing things better, and sometimes you're just not aware of how you could be doing things better, and in certain situations you might be told, and so constructive criticism certainly shouldn't be shied away from. Additionally, we do have an opposition between the Moon and Mercury, and this Moon-Mercury opposition, again, it looks quite verbal. Mercury is the planet of words. Moon is in Taurus, so Moon in Taurus opposition Mercury. It could be words clashing with one another, and you finding that if you talk to someone that you don't agree with everything they say, or rather they don't agree with everything that you say. It could be a bit of both, and the question is, what kind of perspective do you take? Fundamentally, it is a time, Pisces, where you should be putting yourself first. That really does matter, but it's not about just closing down the shutters and not listening at all to what other people are saying. And perhaps Moon opposition Mercury can represent a form of sort of constructive engagement where different opinions come out into the open, and you find out what suits you best. It's about you. I must make that clear. And fundamentally, you are in a strong position. You can hold your ground. Whatever the situation, you can hold your ground. And more than that, you have a view, you have ideas, you have a personality, and you can express all of this with power and conviction. And you will find that people will listen to you. I mean, you've got to listen to other people as well, but at the end, in the final analysis, it's your view that really does matter. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And it's now time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 46, which is pushing upward. I mean, it's a fairly good hexagram. It's about making progress. So, whatever we're doing, we should try to make as much progress as possible. And arguably, it's a good day for making progress. I'm talking a lot about the sextile between Venus and Jupiter. Venus and Jupiter are two very fortunate planets. They're making a fortunate aspect. And so, under the influence of the Venus-Jupiter sextile, there's no reason why we can't make excellent progress, but we have to do it the right way. And the fifth line moves here, and the fifth line is talking about steps. A lot of talk about steps. So whatever you're doing, do it step by step. This is not about making huge amounts of progress suddenly. That's absolutely not what it's about. If you are in too much of a hurry, or you are overwhelmed by your own success, you might have an early success and you might think, oh, this is it, you can really go for it with everything you've got. No, that's not what this is about. It's about taking things slowly and being very dignified about it. So dignity is an important part of it. And it's, of course, being the I Ching, it's talking about the Chinese court in some sort of in the distant past, and how people present themselves in court and how people advance in court, and it's step by step, and it's quite sort of graceful and dignified, and that does matter. That is the way to make progress. Now, because the fifth line moves, we do move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram number 48, which is the well. So the well, it's quite a passive hexagram. It's what we have. It's a source of nourishment. It's something that has always been there, and it should be looked after. And so, because this is moving to the well, what we're doing is we're creating perhaps for ourselves something permanent, something that we can rely on. And if we want to create something reliable that's going to be there not just for today, but is always going to be there, then we've got to do it carefully, step by step. And if we can do it step by step, then we're going to be able to create a situation for ourselves which is going to be fortunate, and it's going to be lasting. And in the process, we shouldn't try to be dramatic. That's unnecessary, and we absolutely should not try to push things too far. It's pushing upward, but pushing upward slowly. If we push forward in a hurry, then soon enough we're going to hit a brick wall. But again, that shouldn't happen. And what we should be looking for to create today is lasting security and lasting sustenance. And that is about the well. We always need the well. Without the well, without the water, there is no life. So that's what we need to be concentrating on. And finally, I want to briefly look at the sextile between Venus and Jupiter. So today, Venus is exactly sextile Jupiter. So let me just show you the moment when Venus is making this sextile. If I can find it, here it is. So this happens today, London time at 12:41 p.m. sort of around lunchtime. So it's going to be this morning if you're in the Americas, this evening if you're in Australia or New Zealand. So there we have Venus at 23:19 Virgo, Jupiter at 23:19 Cancer. So it's a sextile. I kind of regard a sextile as being a bit of a minor aspect. It's not like a conjunction or a square or an opposition or even like a semi-square or a sesquiquadrate, but it's just useful. It's helpful, and this sextile is it's in negative signs: Jupiter in Cancer, Venus in Virgo. So I don't think it's going to be particularly spectacular. And we have to perhaps look at the overall environment of this Venus sextile Jupiter. There are no planets in fire signs, okay, apart from Neptune and Chiron. But when I say no planets, I'm saying no traditional planets in fire signs. And so it's a gentle influence, and because it involves Venus and Jupiter, it's very easy to miss it. So I can go on and on about how lucky Venus sextile Jupiter is, how it can bring us loads and loads of good fortune. But if we get excited about it, if we start to concentrate on Venus sextile Jupiter, well, usually just nothing happens. I mean, that is the problem with Venus and Jupiter in particular. It's very easy to make wonderful forecasts for Jupiter, but so often it doesn't happen. And one reason might be expectation. So you go into today thinking, oh, Wednesday, Venus sextile Jupiter, it's all going to be great. I don't have to do anything. It doesn't happen, and it's very disappointing. That's why Jupiter can be the planet of disappointment. On the other hand, if we take advantage of everything that's available, it might be different, because we're working in a favorable environment. And if we are positive and we work with the energies and we show that we're not complacent, then maybe this Venus sextile Jupiter can work for us. So when looking at Venus sextile Jupiter, how should we see it? Is it necessarily just a fortunate aspect? Venus, I've talked about Venus before, and I've suggested that Venus might be the planet of victory. It might have a warlike element to it. Jupiter can be the planet of release. Something can be released, something can happen. This might be when something blows, and that may not necessarily be fortunate. For example, an industrial accident. And there's certainly one industrial accident that happened, but I'm about to talk about briefly, when Venus is sextile Jupiter, because that's it. I mean, that can just be how we see an aspect. An exact aspect means the moment it happens, particularly if Jupiter is involved. So, we shouldn't necessarily think that it's always going to be fortunate, and we shouldn't forget that Venus is in Virgo. Venus isn't, it's not like it's in Pisces. Venus in Virgo can be problematic. Venus is conjunct the South Node, so just because we see Venus sextile Jupiter doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be good. And Venus sextile Jupiter, I mean, it's in some respects easier than a trine. It's not easier than a trine, because a trine is completely easy. It's perhaps less dangerous than a trine, because a trine is just, you've got easy energy between Venus and Jupiter. At least with a sextile, there is some resistance. But even then, there can be sort of indulgence. And when you're talking about Jupiter, don't forget that Jupiter is about morality, our own personal morality. It's not necessarily a morality which is good. Different people have different moralities. Some people have horrible moralities, but people can still have moralities. And Venus sextile Jupiter can emphasize all of that. So with Venus sextile Jupiter, people might be getting on their moral high horse and pontificating. So now I just want to look at a few people, not many people, who have Venus sextile Jupiter, and then I want to turn to a few Venus-Jupiter events. So Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia had Venus sextile Jupiter. So he was sort of a major figure, conservative figure. He was on the Supreme Court. He was on the Supreme Court in sort of 2000 when essentially the Supreme Court handed Bush the 2000 election. I think that's my view. I mean, it happens both ways. Elections can be stolen in many different ways in America. And so, people sort of have faith in the electoral process, but stolen elections can benefit Republicans. They can also benefit Democrats. So I'm not making a partisan point here, but you can imagine sort of Antonin Scalia, he had a view. He had Venus sextile Jupiter. So someone who has Venus sextile Jupiter, who is a Supreme Court justice, could be very opinionated. He wouldn't regard himself as being opinionated, of course. He has a clear morality of the law. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a great expert on this, but he has, what do they call it? The sort of the was it originalist approach? I haven't really studied American law, but he has a view about the way the law works, and he thinks he's being objective, but at the same time, he's not really being objective. He is bringing in his conservatism, and I'm sure that coloured his decision to essentially give Bush the 2000 election. I'm sure I've generalised it. I mean, I'm sure that things are more complicated than that, and you might have your particular view on the 2000 election. Now, another thing about Antonin Scalia, you couldn't help but notice when you looked at him that he was overweight. I'm afraid to say that. He was overweight. And that might be a way in which you could see Venus sextile Jupiter. Venus sextile Jupiter very much could, enjoy the good things in life. And so maybe that contributed to his death. I mean, he died at a relatively early age. I mean, he didn't continue to an old age. I can't remember precisely when he died, but Antonin Scalia, so he's born in 1936. Okay, he wasn't that young when he died, but he probably could have lived a bit longer if he hadn't been so overweight. And talking about morality and people who have a definite view of the way things should be, there is Klaus Schwab of World Economic Forum fame. So Klaus Schwab had Venus at 2226 Aries, Jupiter at 2248 Aquarius. I don't know exactly where those planets are because I don't have a time of birth, but he had a pretty close Venus-Jupiter sextile. So when you think about Venus-Jupiter, okay, he was fortunate. He was able to, have a presence of mind to get the World Economic Forum together in, I think, 1971, when I think it had its first meeting in Davos. And so he was presumably able to benefit from all of this in, many different ways, Venus sextile Jupiter. But underlying a World Economic Forum would be a morality. Like with Antonin Scalia, again, it might be a morality you disagree with, but he had a philosophy. He did not like the way governments could not interact. That the electorate is a kind of an irritant. That you've got to sort of have a situation where people governments and the elites can communicate in a sort of a environment like Davos and can go beyond the inconveniences of electoral politics. That was his opinion. Venus sextile Jupiter, wanting to go beyond with it, beyond. Venus in Aries. Venus in Aries can be quite domineering, wanting to be in control. Sextile Jupiter in Aquarius. We've now got Pluto in Aquarius, but perhaps there's a totalitarian feel to Jupiter in Aquarius, wanting to embrace the new, and not having to worry about the nation state. And someone with even more power than Klaus Schwab, was Julius Caesar. I mean, I don't think we can be 100% sure that we know what day he was born, but I think this is the most common chart used for Julius Caesar. I don't have a time of birth for Julius Caesar, but he had Venus in Cancer, sextile Jupiter in Taurus, Venus-Mercury conjunction in Cancer. And so Venus sextile Jupiter, you can think about the expansion that he represented. And this Venus-Jupiter sextile with mixed reception. Jupiter is in Venus's sign. Venus is in Jupiter's exaltation. So the expansive side of it is, the general, the Gallic Wars, taking out France and the tribes in Belgium, and so there was, in some ways, no stopping him. And that could be a way Venus sextile Jupiter. There is no stopping him. Crossing the Rubicon, crossing the Rubicon. When he crossed the Rubicon, he went back into Italy. He didn't go away from Italy. He went, because when he was he a proconsul? I don't know. It's a long time since I studied ancient history, but he wasn't allowed to go back into Italy, and the Po was the border, I think. But, so he crossed. Was it the Po? I don't know. It was, but Rubicon was a key river, and so he crossed. He crossed back into Italy and was, of course, breaking all the rules there. And so that's Venus sextile Jupiter. You can't be restricted with Venus sextile Jupiter. And also with Mercury conjunct Venus, that is very talented. And for example, dealing with the calendar and all the sort of the mathematical and civil sides of things. So I think that he's perhaps a good example of Venus sextile Jupiter. And I assume he had a certain morality, and probably a pretty messed up morality, in the sense that he played a big role in ending the Roman Republic. So that's a few people with Venus sextile Jupiter. I mean, not many people. I mean, one person who doesn't crop up in the news, given that we've got issues going on in France, and is Lucie Castex. Lucie Castex, she's a French politician, and sort of a year ago people were talking about her as a potential prime minister. The left bloc wanted her to be prime minister, and Mitterrand refused. And she was had the qualifications supposedly, and she was supported, but Mitterrand decided not to choose her. And she does have she has Venus sextile Jupiter, but she's got a Jupiter at 0 degrees Aries, Venus at 0 degrees Aquarius. So a very close sextile between Venus and Jupiter. She's young, she's in her late 30s, and she's already been incredibly successful, but hasn't been prime minister yet. And so I checked before I made this video. I see there's any recent news about her, and there's no news. It's all about 2024. She seems to have been forgotten. But maybe, we've got a governmental crisis in France at the same time as a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. So it may be that Lucie Castex, because she has an exact Venus-Jupiter in her in a Venus-Jupiter sextile in her chart, she's kind of sensitive to when the Venus is making this sextile. So perhaps this Venus-Jupiter sextile can sort of help her in some ways. I mean, if I were to advise her, for example, I would have said that she should use this opportunity. I don't know what she's doing. I don't know anything about her really, except she's young and successful and was a potential prime minister last year. But this might be a chance where maybe she'll start to crop up in the news, over the next few days. So let me now turn to just a few events that took place, or when Venus was sextile Jupiter, just to give us an idea. And these events are not always fortunate. For example, in Russia, we had the Beslan attack on September the 1st, 2004. when Chechen terrorists went into a school. They killed a load of people, and at the time of this attack, Venus was applying to a sextile of Jupiter, and so that's not really what you'd normally associate with Venus sextile Jupiter. You'd think of something pleasant. So just a reminder, just because there's Venus sextile Jupiter doesn't mean to say you can expect good things. And maybe in this case, Venus was conjunct Saturn, and so that might have created a somewhat sort of deathly influence to this aspect. And another disastrous event that took place, an industrial accident, was Fukushima, when the nuclear power plant in Japan in March 11th, 2011, when it got caught up in a tsunami and there was a huge radiation leak and people were killed. And this took place when Venus was just separating from a sextile to Jupiter. So you could say that this Venus sextile Jupiter sort of coincided with the tsunami, and then the whatever, I don't know, it was a meltdown, but whatever happened in Fukushima. So another reminder, but just because you've got Venus sextile Jupiter, doesn't mean that anything good is going to happen. And so that's a way of looking at it. Now, Venus sextile Jupiter, you might think also that Venus sextile Jupiter would be good for having a meeting. So if you're meeting someone, you're trying to form a relationship with them, so you meet them when Venus is sextile Jupiter. And Trump's first meeting with Zelensky, which was certainly regarded as being pretty disastrous, took place when Venus was sextile Jupiter. And this was on February 28th, 2025 in Washington, D.C. And so there was Venus sextile Venus in Aries, sextile Jupiter in Gemini. So in this case, with Zelensky's meeting, both Venus and Jupiter were in their detriment. So maybe if you've got two Venus and Jupiter in their detriment, Venus in Aries, Jupiter in Gemini, it doesn't work as expected. And in this case, it was the opposite. It did not work at all well. So don't get your hopes up necessarily about Venus sextile Jupiter. Although the current Venus-Jupiter sextile, okay, it is true that Venus is fallen in Virgo. It is in its own triplicity by daytime. Plus, it is sextile Jupiter, which is in Cancer, and what is regarded as, well, maybe a fortunate event is the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. Well, there are two charts for the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, because there is a moment when he formally became president, which was sort of midday on July the 20th. And here Venus was in Pisces, sextile Jupiter in Venus sextile Jupiter. So that's probably the chart to go for. I mean, when he took the oath, it was a bit later. I think that when he took the oath, it was here. The ascendant was still Taurus, just. I think the time I have is 1251, so ascendant at 2959 Taurus, so maybe sort of Taurus rising. So, Venus sextile Jupiter, does that represent his presidency, or does it represent just having a good day? I mean, his inauguration was regarded as being quite spectacular. I mean, his speech that he made, what was it? Ask not what America can do for you, but what you can do for America, or whatever it was. His inauguration speech is well known, and it was seen as a fantastic day, an important day in American history. And so maybe that's what Venus sextile Jupiter is about. It's not, I don't think, talking about the fact that in the end he got assassinated, and I think you would perhaps have to look at other things in the chart to suggest assassination. I mean, if you're into true black moon Lilith, you might notice that Jupiter is exactly opposition true black moon Lilith when he took the oath, and therefore Venus is making a trine to true black moon Lilith. So you might say that true black moon Lilith was making its presence felt at the time of his inauguration. That might have said something about how his presidency ended up, but I think one would have to look at other things in his chart. And finally, the final chart I want to look at is speculative, and that is the martyrdom of St. Valentine. So St. Valentine, he did exist. He lived in Italy, and he was quite a prominent person. He had, apparently, according to the story, he got on quite well with the emperor, Claudius II. And there is a question about when he was martyred. Traditionally, he was martyred on February the 14th. Okay, maybe that's speculative, but it is his day, February the 14th. And he was either, if he was martyred on February the 14th, it would either have been 269 or 270, AD 269 or 2670. I think there are problems with AD 270 because I think Claudius II was out of Italy at the moment. So he wouldn't have been around. I mean, he could still have been martyred in 270, but just that the emperor would not have been in Rome at the time. So I believe that the most likely date for the martyrdom of St. Valentine was February the 14th, 269. Now, why does that matter? Well, of course, we're thinking about Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is about love. It's a very Venus-Jupiter day. And so this is, again, it is perhaps a speculative chart, and I've set it for noon in Rome for the martyrdom of St. Valentine. And again, I must emphasize it's speculative. It did not necessarily happen on this day, but if this day was when he was martyred, it completely fits because you've got Venus at 4 degrees 37 Pisces at noon. You've got Jupiter at 4 degrees 23 Taurus at noon. So you've got an exact Venus-Jupiter sextile. Now, you could say Jupiter is about release. I mean, that is a way of looking at it. And this Venus-Jupiter sextile is in mixed reception. Jupiter is in Venus's sign. Venus is in Jupiter's exaltation. So Venus sextile representing the foundational moment of this whole Valentine's Day romance, love, having the Venus sextile Jupiter in it is really completely appropriate, I think. So those are my forecasts for today, plus some views on Venus sextile Jupiter. I hope you found this video of some interest. If you enjoyed this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I would be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.